An Apache found her cowered and shaking behind the tavern, until he vowed she'd never fear anyone again. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A thick fog had settled over the town of Red Oak, Texas, and the tavern stood like an ominous shadow at the heart of it. Inside, the warmth of the fire barely reached the corners of the dark, quiet room. The usual noise of laughter and clinking glasses had vanished, replaced by whispers and nervous glances. At the far end of the room, in the shadows behind a worn wooden pillar, a young woman crouched, her body trembling. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror as she pulled her cloak tighter around her. Her name was Sarah, and for months now, she had been running, escaping a past that chased her like a relentless storm. Tonight, she was cornered. The outlaws who had tormented her for weeks had found her again. They had tracked her to this small town, and now they were closing in, their eyes set on her, as if she were a prize. She had been hiding in the tavern for hours, hoping they wouldn't find her, but the sound of boots echoing on the wooden floor told her it was only a matter of time. She had no escape. Sarah had once been a woman of promise. She had come to the West with dreams of a new life, a life far from the dangers of her past. But that was before the outlaws found her family and took everything from her. Before they forced her to flee, leaving behind a life she had worked so hard to build. She had tried to fight back, tried to protect herself, but there had been no way to outrun the violence that had followed her across the country. And now, it seemed, there was no place left for her to hide. She had nearly given up hope when a figure appeared in the doorway of the tavern. A tall, rugged man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a seasoned hunter. His face was hard, weathered by years of living on the edge of survival. He was Apache, and from the way he carried himself, it was clear that he was no stranger to danger. As he made his way toward the back of the tavern, his eyes met Sarah's. In that instant, something inside her shifted. His presence was commanding, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. She hadn't expected to be saved by a stranger, especially not one from a people she had been taught to fear. But in that moment, she realized that this man, this Apache warrior, could be her only chance for survival. Without a word, he walked to the corner where Sarah hid, crouched down, and extended his hand to her. "Come with me," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. She hesitated for a moment, fear rising in her chest. But then, she saw the resolve in his eyes, the promise that no harm would come to her while he was there. She took his hand, and together, they slipped out the back door of the tavern, into the night, leaving behind the outlaws and the terror they had brought. As they disappeared into the shadows, Sarah's heart began to slow, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that she might finally be safe. The sound of Sarah's breath was all she could hear as she followed the Apache warrior through the darkened streets. The tavern's clamor had faded into the distance, swallowed by the thick night air, but the weight of her fear had not. Every step she took was filled with the thought of the outlaws still searching for her. She could feel their eyes on her even now, as though they would appear from any corner, just out of reach. But the man beside her walked with a calm certainty, his every move steady and precise. He was a stranger, yet she felt a strange sense of security in his presence. He had not said much since they left the tavern, and Sarah had no words of her own to offer. The darkness seemed to press in around them, but she felt drawn to the quiet strength he emanated. It had been days since she had felt safe, and in his presence, she could almost forget the terror that had gripped her. The sound of hooves on dirt broke the silence, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening as she instinctively reached for the knife she had kept hidden in her boot. The Apache warrior did not pause. He simply turned to her, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice low and commanding. She obeyed without thinking. They moved swiftly, ducking into the cover of a narrow alleyway, the shadows providing some semblance of protection. Sarah's eyes darted to the sounds of the horses as they approached, the men still searching. She could feel her hands trembling, her grip on the knife tightening. The warrior was silent, and his movements were almost too fluid to follow. His every action was calculated. He was watching, listening, waiting. He knew the land, the sounds of the night. She had never been around someone like him. The men on horseback slowed as they neared the alley, their voices drifting faintly through the air. She couldn't have gone far, one of them growled. Sarah froze. She could hear the thud of her heart, her breath shallow in her chest. The Apache warrior held up his hand, signaling for her to be still. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah's mind raced. She could hear the men as they dismounted, their boots crunching on the ground. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the sound of the horses faded. The men had passed. The Apache warrior exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. He turned to Sarah and gave her a brief nod. They are gone for now, he said, his voice like gravel. We must keep moving. She nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her, but it was brief. They were not safe yet. She could still feel the eyes of the outlaws on her, like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She had no idea where they were headed, but at this moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting away, getting as far from the men who had caused so much pain. As they continued their journey through the quiet town, Sarah took in the details around her, the sights and sounds that she had not noticed before. The houses were small and run down, the streets empty in the dead of night. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They passed a few homes, all dark and silent, but then, ahead, Sarah saw the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. The Apache warrior's steps faltered for just a moment before he picked up the pace. He turned his head slightly, as if assessing the situation. We go there, he said, pointing toward the light. Sarah glanced at him, puzzled. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning the path ahead. You will be safe, he said simply. They approached the house with caution, moving toward the door as quietly as possible. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped out to greet them. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she saw the woman who stood before them. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, her face weathered by time. But there was something in her eyes, an understanding, a calm certainty, that put Sarah at ease. The Apache warrior spoke in a language Sarah didn't understand, his voice low but firm. The woman nodded, and Sarah could see the exchange between them, the silent communication. After a few moments, the woman turned to Sarah and smiled warmly. Come in, she said softly. You are safe here. Sarah hesitated for a moment, still uncertain, but the warrior's presence behind her gave her the courage to step forward. She entered the house, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the chill of the night. The woman led them into a small room, its walls lined with books and trinkets. The air smelled of herbs and something earthy, comforting. You will stay here, the woman said, her voice gentle. No one will harm you. Sarah sat down on a chair near the fire, her body still shaking from the events of the night. She looked up at the woman, her voice barely a whisper. Who are you? The woman smiled again, her eyes twinkling with kindness. I am someone who understands fear, she said softly, and someone who knows how to protect what's worth saving. The warrior stood by the door, his gaze still sharp, watching for any sign of danger. Sarah could not shake the feeling that they were not yet safe, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax just a little. She was alive. She was safe, for now. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Sarah sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of herbal tea the woman had given her. The night had been long and full of fear, but now, in the quiet safety of this small house, the tension in her shoulders slowly began to ease. The Apache warrior stood by the window, his gaze always watchful, always alert. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, but Sarah could feel the weight of his presence, his quiet strength reassuring her. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen to help her, but she was grateful. After what felt like hours, the woman who had greeted them earlier returned with a blanket and a pillow. You need rest, she said, her voice soft but firm. You've been through much. Sarah nodded, too exhausted to argue. She lay down on the bed the woman had prepared for her, the warmth of the blanket a welcome comfort. As she closed her eyes, the sound of the wind outside seemed to lull her into a light sleep. She dreamed of running, always running, until the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she was falling, unable to stop. The wind howled louder in her dream, and she woke with a start, her breath shallow and fast. She sat up, her heart racing, but the room was quiet. The woman was still in the kitchen, and the Apache warrior was standing by the door, watching the night. The nightmare lingered, its shadow stretching over her thoughts. Sarah pushed herself out of bed, her feet hitting the cool wooden floor. She moved quietly toward the window, her body stiff from the tension of the night before. Outside, the town of Red Oak was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the dirt roads. The warrior turned slightly as she approached, his eyes meeting hers. "You should rest," he said, his voice low and calming. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I can't," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the fear that still gripped her chest. "I feel like they're still out there. Like they're waiting for me." The warrior's expression softened slightly. He stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. "They are not close," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "But they will come." Sarah's stomach tightened at the words. She had known this was not over. She had known that escaping from Red Oak would not mean escaping her past. But hearing the warrior speak the truth out loud made it more real, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her chest. She turned away from the window, her hands gripping the sill. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Apache warrior stood still for a moment, watching her. Then, he spoke again, his words deliberate, filled with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "You do not run anymore. You stand your ground." His words hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a flicker of something inside her, something she had buried deep. Fear, yes, but also strength. The fear of being caught, of being a victim again, still gnawed at her. But there was also a part of her that wanted to believe in the promise the warrior had made, that she would never fear anyone again. But how? How could she stop running when everything she knew had been taken from her? The warrior seemed to read the doubt in her eyes. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming but not threatening. "I will teach you," he said simply. "The ways of my people. How to defend yourself. How to stand strong." Sarah looked up at him, meeting his gaze. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the same strength that had kept him calm through everything. He wasn't offering her false hope. He was offering her something real. The promise of protection, but also the promise of power. "You are not alone," he said, as if sensing her thoughts. "You are part of something much bigger now, and I will help you find your strength." Sarah felt a rush of emotions flood through her. Relief, fear, hope, and something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. She nodded slowly, a spark of determination lighting in her chest. "Teach me," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. The warrior nodded, his eyes softening just a fraction. "We will start tomorrow," he said. "Rest tonight, and tomorrow we will begin." As Sarah lay back down on the bed, she felt the weight of the day's events start to settle in her bones. But there was also something new. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could stop running. Maybe she could stand her ground. She closed her eyes again, this time falling into a deeper sleep, her dreams filled with the quiet strength of the Apache warrior and the promise of the days to come. The morning arrived quietly, the first light of dawn slipping through the cracks of the wooden walls. Sarah woke to the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee, the kind of comforting sense she had almost forgotten. The bed beneath her felt softer than the cold ground she had slept on for weeks. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and listened. The house was still. The Apache warrior stood by the door, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon outside. It had been days since they had arrived at the woman's house, and the silence that surrounded them felt like a fragile thing, easily shattered. But as Sarah looked around the room, the feeling of safety had begun to settle into her bones. She could breathe again. She had not allowed herself to truly relax since the day she had fled Red Oak, but now, in this moment, she could almost forget the terror that had chased her. Almost. The woman, who Sarah had learned was named Eliza, was busy in the kitchen, her back turned as she worked. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the sound oddly soothing. Sarah took a deep breath and slowly stood, her body stiff but not as tired as it had been the night before. Her legs were still weak from days of running. but she felt the strength of the warrior's promise beginning to sink in. She was not alone anymore. Eliza looked over her shoulder and smiled when she saw Sarah moving. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I made some breakfast for you. You must be hungry." Sarah smiled back, grateful for the woman's kindness. She had not expected much from strangers, especially after all she had been through, but Eliza had welcomed her without hesitation, without question. She had been given a safe place to stay, a refuge from the past. "Thank you," Sarah replied quietly, her voice still shaky from the remnants of fear. Eliza set a plate of food down in front of her and gestured to the seat across from her. "Eat. You need your strength. And you'll need it today." Sarah's curiosity stirred. "Today?" she asked, picking up her fork. Eliza nodded. "Today, you will start your training." Sarah paused mid-bite, unsure of what to say. She had not expected to begin so soon. "Training?" she asked, looking over at the Apache warrior, who was now standing near the door, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. "The warrior will teach you how to defend yourself," Eliza said softly. "You are safe here, but you cannot rely on others to protect you forever. You must learn to protect yourself." Sarah swallowed hard. The thought of facing the dangers of the outside world again filled her with unease, but she knew Eliza was right. The warrior had offered her protection, but it would not last forever. She needed to be able to stand on her own. "I'm ready," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. The Apache warrior finally spoke, his deep voice steady and commanding. "Good," he said, stepping into the room. "We begin now." Sarah stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mix of fear and excitement. She was about to face something new, something she had never imagined for herself. The warrior moved with precision, his every movement controlled and deliberate. He gestured for her to follow him outside, and she did, her feet heavy on the ground. Outside, the sun was rising, casting long shadows on the earth. The air was cool, but the warrior's presence was like fire. He was still, watching her carefully as she approached. "The first lesson is simple," he said, his voice low. "You must be aware of your surroundings. If you cannot see danger, it will find you before you are ready." Sarah nodded, trying to focus, trying to push the fear from her mind. She had always been good at staying alert, always looking over her shoulder. But now, with the warrior watching her, she felt the weight of his expectations. "Look around," he instructed. Sarah glanced around, taking in the woods that surrounded them. The trees were tall and dense, the ground covered with thick grass and shrubs. It was quiet, almost eerily so, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "Where is the danger?" he asked. Sarah paused, her eyes scanning the trees. She could see nothing, no movement, no threat. But she knew better than to let her guard down. "I don't see anything," she said, her voice unsure. "That is the point," the warrior replied. "You must always be prepared. Danger does not announce itself." He moved silently toward the trees, his body a blur of motion. He was fast, faster than Sarah had ever imagined. "If you are not ready, you will be caught off guard," he continued. "You must move like the wind, swift and quiet. You must know how to fight and how to flee. The key is to always have a plan." Sarah watched him closely, trying to absorb everything he said. He stopped in front of a large tree and turned back to her. "Now, we begin," he said, his eyes piercing. "You will follow me, and I will show you how to move like the wind." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had never fought, never been trained to defend herself. But she had no choice now. She had to learn, for her survival, for her future. And so, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Sarah took her first step toward learning how to fight. She would learn to defend herself, to stand her ground, and to face whatever came next. With the Apache warrior by her side, she would never fear anyone again. The days blurred together as Sarah's training with the Apache warrior continued. Each morning, she woke with a sense of purpose, the weight of her past still lingering, but slowly replaced by something new, strength. The warrior taught her the ways of his people, how to move silently, how to listen to the land, and how to defend herself when the time came. At first, it had been difficult. Her muscles were stiff from the days of running and hiding, and her mind still raced with the memories of fear. But with every lesson, every step she took toward mastering her new skills, the fear began to recede. Her body grew stronger, her movements more fluid. She learned how to hold a blade, how to track and hunt, how to fight without hesitation. Each lesson felt like a step closer to becoming the person she needed to be. The warrior was patient with her, offering little words of encouragement when she succeeded and quiet guidance when she faltered. His silence, though heavy at times, was a comfort. It was as if he understood that she needed the space to grow, to find her own strength. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training session, Sarah collapsed onto the grass, her breath heavy in her chest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The warrior stood nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. "You've done well," he said, his voice low but approving. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and sat up, looking at him. "I'm getting better, aren't I?" she asked, a hint of pride in her voice. The warrior nodded. "Yes, but there is more to learn. You must never stop." Sarah's stomach twisted. "I know," she said softly. She could feel the weight of his words. She wasn't just training to protect herself. She was preparing for something that she wasn't fully ready to face. The outlaws were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to find her. She knew it was only a matter of time before they came. The warrior's gaze shifted to the horizon, his face unreadable. "They will come," he said quietly. "But you are ready now." Sarah felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had no intention of letting them find her again. No longer would she be the frightened girl who had run from the terror of the past. She was stronger now, and she would fight to survive. The warrior turned and walked toward the small campfire they had built that evening. "Come," he said. "There is more for you to learn." Sarah stood up, dusting off the dirt from her clothes, and followed him. As they walked toward the fire, the sounds of the forest around them seemed to grow quieter, as if even nature was holding its breath. They sat down by the fire, the warmth of the flames licking the cool night air. The warrior looked at her, his eyes steady. "There is one final lesson," he said, his voice low. "It is not just about fighting. It is about knowing when to stand and when to run." Sarah frowned. "Run?" she asked. "But I thought, the greatest warriors know when to retreat." The warrior interrupted. "It is not weakness. It is wisdom. Sometimes, the battle is not worth fighting. Sometimes, you must wait for the right moment." Sarah looked at the flames, her mind racing. "And how do I know when that moment is?" The warrior remained silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he spoke, his words deliberate. "You will know. The land will speak to you. The wind will guide you. You will feel it in your heart." Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing his words. It was a lesson she hadn't expected, but one that made sense. She had been taught to fight, to stand her ground, but she had never considered that sometimes survival meant knowing when to flee. "I understand," she said quietly. The warrior's gaze softened, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "You are ready," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "When the time comes, you will know what to do." The silence between them was comforting now. The fire crackled, sending small sparks into the night air. Sarah sat back, her eyes on the flames. The warrior was right. She had learned so much in such a short time, but there was still so much to understand. As the stars began to twinkle above, Sarah realized that she wasn't the same person who had arrived in the small town days ago. She had changed, and the warrior's words echoed in her mind. "You are ready." She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could face it. With the Apache warrior by her side, she was no longer running. She was standing, ready for whatever came next. The sun rose the next morning, casting long, golden shadows across the earth. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the light filter through the trees. She had been awake for hours, her mind still spinning from the conversations she had with the Apache warrior and Eliza the night before. Today, she would learn more than just how to fight. She would learn when to act and when to wait. She would face her future with the strength she had found in herself over the past few days. The warrior had taught her many things, but today, it would be different. Today, they would begin tracking. "Come," the warrior said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He was already standing near his horse, his gear ready. He motioned for Sarah to join him. "It is time to put everything you've learned to use." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of both fear and excitement. She had spent the past days training her body and her mind, but today would be the test. She had learned how to read the land, how to move silently, how to fight if needed, but this was something else. Tracking was an art of patience, of reading subtle signs that most people would miss. Stay alert. The warrior instructed as they mounted their horses and began their journey into the woods. The land speaks to those who listen. They rode in silence, the sound of hooves the only noise in the stillness of the forest. Sarah's senses were sharp as she scanned the ground, looking for any sign of movement, any clue that would indicate they were on the right path. After an hour of steady riding, the warrior slowed his horse. He dismounted with ease and crouched down, his fingers brushing the ground. "Do you see it?" he asked, his eyes intense. Sarah studied the earth, her mind racing. Then, she spotted it. A broken twig, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. She pointed to it. "There," she said. "The twig is snapped." The warrior nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Yes. Good. The signs are subtle. You must learn to see the small things that others miss." He stood up and walked a few paces forward, scanning the ground again. Sarah followed him, her eyes constantly moving. The warrior continued, his voice steady. "In the wild, everything tells a story. The direction the wind blows, the way the leaves rustle, the faintest mark in the dirt. The signs are everywhere, but only those who truly listen can hear them." They moved deeper into the woods, following the trail left by their prey. Sarah's mind was focused entirely on the task, the weight of the world forgotten for a moment. This was what she had been training for. This was the purpose she had longed for. As they rode, Sarah began to notice more signs. Broken branches, footprints in the soft earth, even the movement of birds in the trees, all pointing them in the right direction. The warrior spoke little, letting the silence of the forest fill the space between them. Hours passed, and Sarah's concentration never wavered. She was learning more in this single morning than she had in the previous days of training. Her confidence grew with each step. The warrior led her through thick underbrush and across streams, each challenge testing her ability to adapt and observe. She had learned how to track animals in the past, but this was different. It was about survival, not sport. Eventually, they came to a small clearing, and the warrior held up his hand, signaling for Sarah to stop. He dismounted and motioned for her to follow. "We are close," he said. The air was thick with anticipation. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she followed him through the trees. They approached a small hill, and from there, they could see the faint outline of a camp in the distance. "What do you see?" the warrior asked, his voice low. Sarah studied the scene carefully. "A camp," she said. "A few tents. But it looks empty. No smoke. No movement." The warrior's eyes narrowed as he examined the camp. "It's a decoy," he muttered. "They want us to think they've gone, but they're still there, waiting." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The warrior looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "We wait," he said. "Patience is just as important as action. You must learn to know when to strike and when to remain hidden. Today, we will test your patience." They waited for hours, crouched low in the underbrush, watching the camp from a distance. The sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Sarah's legs ached from the crouching, but she held her position, watching for any sign of movement. As night began to fall, the warrior stood and motioned for Sarah to follow. They had seen enough. The camp had been a trap, and now they knew how to deal with it. "You did well today," the warrior said as they turned to leave. "You learned more than just how to fight. You learned when to wait, when to observe, when to hold back. These are the skills that will keep you alive." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had done it. She had learned to track, to wait, to be patient. And with each lesson, she grew stronger. As they rode back to their camp, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She was no longer just running. She was standing, learning, and preparing for whatever came next. The days following their journey into the woods became a blur of training and preparation. Sarah had never felt so focused, so alive. Each lesson from the Apache warrior was a step toward reclaiming the strength she had lost. The fear she had carried for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet, unwavering confidence. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled from Red Oak. She had learned the skills to survive, to fight if needed, and to wait patiently for the right moment. The warrior's lessons had taught her the importance of stillness and observation. Patience was just as powerful as action. In the days that followed, she had learned to live by that principle. But despite the growing strength inside her, a nagging feeling of unease lingered. The warrior had told her that the outlaws would come. They would not stop until they found her. But there was more to it now. Sarah knew that the warrior had been holding something back. The constant training, the quiet intensity of his demeanor. It all pointed to something bigger, something she hadn't yet fully understood. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire, the warrior's gaze shifted, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. He had not spoken much that morning, but now, he looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "It's time," he said, his voice steady. "They are close." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening. The moment she had been preparing for had arrived. She had learned everything she could, but now, it was time to face the outlaws. She had no more time for lessons. "Are you ready?" the warrior asked, his tone soft but firm. Sarah looked into his eyes, her mind racing. She had trained for this. She had learned how to fight, how to track, how to survive. But she hadn't faced them yet. She hadn't truly been tested. She nodded, the fear creeping back into her chest, but she forced it down. "I'm ready." The warrior stood, his movements fluid and precise, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He extended a hand, his fingers brushing hers. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Sarah could see the quiet strength in his gaze, the determination that had carried him through countless battles. He trusted her, and that trust was all she needed. Together, they moved swiftly through the trees, the sounds of the forest now a distant hum as they focused on the task ahead. The warrior led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every movement, every rustle of the leaves. Sarah followed closely behind, her senses heightened, every nerve on edge. The air was thick with anticipation as they made their way deeper into the woods. They stopped when they reached a clearing, the tall grass swaying gently in the wind. The warrior crouched low, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Sarah followed his gaze and saw the telltale signs of movement. There, in the distance, were the outlaws. She could see the figures moving, their silhouettes barely visible through the trees. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was it. The moment had arrived. The warrior's voice broke through the silence. "Stay close. Stay silent. Let them come to us." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the handle of the knife she had learned to wield. She had fought against her fear in the past, but now, it was different. The fear was gone. There was only the task at hand. The outlaws were drawing closer, their voices growing louder. Sarah could hear the rough laughter, the cursing. They were close now. The warrior's hand brushed against her arm, a silent signal to stay still. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the outlaws, their eyes scanning the forest, unaware of the danger that lay just a few yards away. The warrior remained motionless, his body blending into the shadows, his presence barely noticeable. Sarah, too, stayed still, every muscle in her body tensed. She knew that the moment they were spotted, everything would change. The outlaws moved closer, their eyes still darting around. Sarah could see the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek. He looked every bit the part of a dangerous outlaw, his eyes cold and calculating. "Where is she?" the man growled, his voice low and threatening. "She couldn't have gone far. We'll find her." The tension in the air thickened, the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck standing on end. The warrior slowly reached for his bow, his movements deliberate, controlled. He was waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah's fingers tightened around her knife as she watched the leader. The moment he made a move, everything would change. Then, without warning, the warrior moved. It was swift, like a shadow in the night. He lunged at the nearest outlaw, knocking him to the ground with a single, powerful strike. The outlaws barely had time to react. Sarah moved with the warrior, her knife flashing in the dim light as she took down another one of the attackers. She fought with everything she had, her training, her strength, the fear that had once held her back now replaced with the unshakable will to survive. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The outlaws lay scattered on the ground, their weapons discarded. The warrior stood tall, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Sarah stood beside him, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She had done it. She had faced them and survived. "You fought well," the warrior said, his voice soft but filled with approval. Sarah looked at him, a feeling of pride swelling in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. She had faced her past, faced the fear, and emerged victorious. The warrior had kept his promise. She would never fear anyone again. The days after the battle with the outlaws felt strangely calm. The forest, which had once felt full of threats, now felt like a quiet sanctuary. Sarah and the Apache warrior, along with Eliza, had moved further into the hills, seeking a place to rest, to regroup, and to reflect on the battle they had just won. They had left behind the remnants of the outlaws, their bodies still lying in the clearing, proof of the battle that had been fought. But now, it was time to move on. Sarah knew the war was not over. The outlaws would not give up easily. They would return. The question now was, were they ready for that? The warrior had not spoken much since the fight. He had offered Sarah a quiet nod of approval after the battle, but that was all. He was still watching her, still teaching her the skills she needed to survive. But it was different now. Sarah felt a sense of empowerment that she had never felt before. She had fought, she had survived, and for the first time, she felt capable of standing on her own. Eliza, too, had noticed the change in Sarah. The woman had watched the young woman grow stronger each day, and she had seen the determination in Sarah's eyes when the battle was over. But Eliza knew that this peace would not last long. The outlaws would regroup, and they would come after Sarah again. The warrior had given Sarah a choice after the fight: stay and learn, or move on. He had spoken little, but his words had been clear. He had trained her well, but the road ahead was still uncertain. It was Sarah's decision now. One evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, Sarah sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Her thoughts were heavy, filled with what the future held. She could feel the weight of the warrior's gaze on her. He was sitting beside her, silent as always, his presence comforting. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the question she had been carrying for days. The warrior looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked. The question surprised Sarah. She had always been the one to follow, to obey. But now, for the first time, she had a choice. She could stay and continue learning, or she could leave. The warrior had given her the freedom to decide. Sarah thought for a long moment, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. She had thought about this for days. She had come to the West to escape, to find a new life. But now, she was different. She had found something here: strength, purpose, and a sense of belonging. She didn't want to leave. "I want to stay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I want to learn more." The warrior nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Then stay," he said simply. "But know this, the road ahead is not easy. There are many challenges yet to come." Sarah's heart raced. She knew the challenges he spoke of, but she wasn't afraid. She had learned so much already. The warrior had taught her how to move through the forest, how to track, how to defend herself. But now, there was something else. It was time to learn how to truly face the world. The warrior stood and extended his hand to Sarah. "Come," he said. "There is more to learn. And it begins now." Sarah stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready. Together, they walked into the forest, Sarah following closely behind the warrior. The world around them was quiet, the sounds of the forest the only noise. The trees towered above them, casting long shadows on the ground. It was peaceful here, but Sarah knew that peace was fleeting. The outlaws would come again, but this time, she would be ready. She had learned to listen to the land, to move like the wind. She had learned to survive. And now, she would learn to fight back. The warrior led her deeper into the woods, his steps sure and steady. He had not spoken much, but Sarah could feel the weight of his presence. He was preparing her for something, for the day when they would face the outlaws again. The journey would not be easy, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She had been given a chance, and she would take it. As they moved through the woods, Sarah's mind raced. She thought about everything she had learned and everything she still needed to learn. She thought about the future and what it might hold. But most of all, she thought about the warrior and the trust he had placed in her. She was no longer a frightened woman running from her past. She was a warrior in her own right, and she was ready for whatever came next. The days following Sarah's decision to stay felt different. The warriors' training grew more intense as they moved deeper into the forest, away from the safety of the camp they had established. Each lesson brought her closer to mastering the skills needed to survive in a world that was unforgiving and harsh. The warrior pushed her hard, testing her limits, and urging her to confront the fear she had carried for so long. The first few days had been filled with constant movement, tracking, building, and preparing for what they both knew was inevitable. The outlaws were still out there, and they would come. Sarah knew this with a certainty that left her restless, her body aching from the physical demands of the training, but her mind sharp. They spent the nights under the stars, moving from one temporary shelter to the next, always on the move. Each day, the warrior taught her something new. They practiced stealth, learning how to slip through the woods without making a sound. They worked with weapons, knives, bows, and even the basics of hand-to-hand combat. The warrior showed her how to be resourceful, to make use of everything the land provided. There were moments of silence between them, but Sarah had grown used to the warrior's quiet strength. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. "Patience," he would say, his voice low and firm. "Patience will save your life." She had learned the importance of waiting for the right moment to strike, to move, to act. She had learned to read the land, to feel the shifts in the wind, and to trust the signs. But despite all that she had learned, there were still moments when the fear crept back in. At night, when the campfire was low and the sounds of the forest filled the air, she would lie awake, her thoughts filled with the memory of the outlaws and the terror they had caused her. She had survived the battle, but the fear of facing them again made her stomach churn. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for something more, for the chance to live without fear. One night, as they sat by the fire, the warrior spoke of the past. Sarah had never asked about his life before the forest. She had never pressed him for details. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, something that urged her to ask. "Why do you fight?" she asked, her voice quiet in the stillness of the night. The warrior was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the flames. Sarah waited, not knowing if he would answer, but hoping he would. Finally, he spoke. "I fight because it is my way," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It is the way of my people. We are warriors, protectors. We fight to survive, to preserve what is ours. I fight for my family, for my tribe. And now, I fight for you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had never considered that he might be fighting for her. "But you don't have to," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and confusion. "You've already done so much." The warrior looked at her then, his eyes intense. "It is my choice," he said simply, "and I choose to protect you." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Sarah realized that the warrior had not just been training her out of duty. He had chosen to stand by her, to help her become something stronger than she had ever been. The warrior's protection was not just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that Sarah had never truly understood until now. "You are not alone," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "And you never will be." Sarah nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had feared being alone, feared facing the world without anyone to stand beside her. But now, with the warrior by her side, she knew that she was not alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees broke the silence, and the warrior stood, stretching his legs. "We move out at dawn," he said. "The time is near. The outlaws will come." Sarah stood with him, her body tense with anticipation. The days of waiting were over. It was time to act. She had learned all she could from the warrior. She had learned how to survive, how to fight, and how to wait for the right moment. Now, she was ready to face the enemy. The warrior gave her one last look before he turned and began packing up their camp. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. "Stay strong. And remember, when the time comes, you will know what to do." As the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, Sarah felt the weight of the coming battle settle into her chest. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Red Oak. She was a warrior now, ready to face whatever came next. And when the outlaws came for her again, she would be ready. The next morning, the world seemed different. The air was still and heavy with the weight of the coming storm, both literal and figurative. Sarah stood beside the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. Her body was tense, every muscle prepared for what lay ahead. The warrior had been silent all morning, his expression unreadable as he packed their gear. He moved with a purpose, each action deliberate, his eyes scanning the horizon, constantly alert. Sarah felt the intensity of the moment settle over her. Today was the day. They had trained, they had prepared, and now they would face the outlaws once again. The warrior had said they would come, and Sarah knew that it was only a matter of time before they would be here. As the fire burned low and the sky began to lighten, Sarah could feel the pulse of anticipation in the air. The warrior approached her, his face still as hard as stone. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm and steady. "Do not let your guard down. The time is here." Sarah nodded, her heart racing. She had learned so much over the past few weeks. She had trained in the art of survival, in the way of the warrior. She knew how to fight, how to move with the land, how to remain calm under pressure. But now, it was time to put everything into action. They mounted their horses and moved through the forest, the trees towering overhead, their branches rustling in the early morning breeze. The warrior led the way, his movements smooth and silent. Sarah followed closely behind, her eyes scanning every shadow, every movement, every sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself knew what was coming. The warrior did not speak as they moved, his focus solely on the path ahead. Sarah's senses were heightened, every sound magnified. The crunch of the leaves underfoot, the faint rustling of the branches above, the distant call of a bird. All of it seemed to echo in the silence around them. As they reached the edge of the forest, the warrior signaled for them to stop. He dismounted quietly and motioned for Sarah to do the same. "We wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They are near." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The outlaws were close. She could feel it in her bones. The warrior's eyes flicked to the horizon, scanning for any signs of movement. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. They waited in silence, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts swirling with everything they had prepared for. She knew what was at stake. This was not just a fight for survival. This was a fight for her future, for her chance to live without fear. She had come a long way since the day she first ran from Red Oak. She had learned to fight, to survive, and now, she would face the very people who had taken everything from her. The warrior's voice cut through her thoughts. "Stay low," he instructed. "When they come, we strike quickly. Do not hesitate." Sarah nodded, her breath steady, her hands gripping the reins of her horse. She had trained for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it all settled over her. This was no longer a lesson. This was real. The sound of hooves echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's pulse quickened as she looked to the warrior, who gave her a brief nod. The time had come. They were here. The outlaws appeared in the clearing ahead, their faces grim and determined. There were 5 of them, mounted and armed, their eyes scanning the area. Sarah could see the leader of the group, a man with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had no fear. The warrior's eyes narrowed as he observed the group, his hand on his weapon, ready for action. "Wait for my signal," he whispered to Sarah. "When they are close, we strike." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her focus. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The outlaws rode closer, their horses kicking up dust as they moved through the clearing. They seemed unaware of the danger that lay just ahead. Sarah's eyes flicked between the warrior and the outlaws, waiting for the right moment to act. The leader gave an order, and the group slowed, their attention focused on something ahead of them. The warrior made his move. In a flash, he was on his feet, moving like a shadow through the trees. He lunged at the nearest outlaw, knocking him to the ground with a swift, powerful strike. Sarah followed his lead, her knife flashing in the sunlight as she took down another of the attackers. The battle was over almost as quickly as it began. The outlaws were scattered, their weapons discarded. The warrior stood tall, his expression calm as he surveyed the aftermath. Sarah stood beside him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hands were still trembling, but her mind was clear. She had faced the outlaws, and she had survived. "You did well," the warrior said, his voice soft but filled with approval. Sarah looked up at him, her chest swelling with pride. "Thank you," she said quietly. The warrior nodded and motioned toward the clearing. "We must move," he said. "There may be more coming." They turned and began to move, their steps steady and determined. Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer running. She was standing her ground, ready to face whatever came next. The sun had long set, and the cool night air filled Sarah's lungs as she and the Apache warrior made their way through the dense forest. The battle had ended swiftly, and while they had won, the warrior's words kept echoing in her mind. There may be more coming. He had been right, of course. The outlaws would not give up. It was only a matter of time before they returned, seeking revenge. The warrior was always calm, always prepared. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen battle, someone who knew the way of the land better than anyone else. Sarah, however, was still shaken. The fight had been brief, but the rush of adrenaline and the violence of it all had left her feeling vulnerable. She had done what she had been trained to do, and yet, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if there were more enemies. What if they were not enough? As they traveled, the warrior remained silent, his attention fixed on the path ahead. Sarah, on the other hand, could not help but look over her shoulder, her senses heightened, every snap of a twig making her tense. She was alert, but also deeply aware of the warrior's steady presence beside her. He had told her many times that fear was natural. It was what you did with that fear that mattered. Focus, he had said. Fear can sharpen you if you let it. She wanted to believe that. She needed to. After all, what was she without the strength he had helped her find? She knew she had changed since meeting him. She had become someone who could face her past, someone who could fight and defend herself. Yet, doubt still lingered. They reached a small clearing, and the warrior stopped, motioning for Sarah to do the same. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. He scanned the area carefully before kneeling, his movements precise. Sarah joined him, watching him closely. "What are we waiting for?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The warrior did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued to study the surrounding area, his expression unwavering. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "They're close," he said, "but they are not alone." Sarah's heart quickened at his words. She could feel the tension rising in the air. The outlaws were not just hunting her, they were hunting them. The warrior looked at her, his gaze steady. "This will not be easy," he said, "but it is time to face them." Sarah nodded. She was ready. The training, the countless lessons, had prepared her for this moment. She had learned to survive, to track, to fight. But there was something else she had learned in the days leading up to this. She had learned to trust herself. The warrior had given her the tools, but it was up to her to use them. They moved quietly, staying low as they made their way through the trees. Sarah's steps were silent, her senses sharp. The warrior led the way, his movements fluid and sure. She followed him, her focus solely on the task ahead. The air was thick with anticipation, and the tension between them was palpable. As they neared the edge of the clearing, the warrior held up a hand, signaling for Sarah to stop. They crouched behind a large boulder, peering out at the scene before them. The outlaws had set up camp, their fire crackling in the center of the clearing. They were gathering their weapons, preparing for something, but what? Sarah's mind raced. There were 5 of them, just like before, but they had brought more supplies, more weapons. This wasn't just a search, they were planning something bigger. The warrior's gaze never wavered. He was studying the outlaws, observing their every move. "They're getting ready for another raid," he muttered, almost to himself. "But they will not be prepared for us." Sarah felt a surge of determination. She had faced them before, and she would do it again. But this time, she wasn't just following the warrior's lead. This time, she was standing with him. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady. The warrior turned to her, his eyes piercing. "We wait," he said simply. "We need to catch them off guard." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment. The stakes were higher now. The outlaws would not just be after her this time. They were hunting both of them, and they had to be prepared. As the minutes ticked by, the air grew heavier. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced around the clearing. The outlaws were still focused on their preparations, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Sarah's mind was sharp, her senses on high alert. She could hear every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig. Her eyes darted between the outlaws and the warrior, who remained motionless beside her. Time seemed to stretch, and then, finally, the moment came. The warrior nodded, signaling for Sarah to move. They moved as one, a fluid motion, their bodies blending with the night. Sarah's heart raced as they closed in on the outlaws. The warrior struck first, his movements swift and deadly. Sarah followed, her knife flashing in the moonlight as she took down one of the attackers. The battle was swift, each of them moving with purpose and precision. The outlaws had no chance. The warrior and Sarah worked together seamlessly, a partnership forged in silence and trust. When it was over, the outlaws lay scattered on the ground, defeated. Sarah stood tall, her breath heavy, her body trembling from the rush of battle. She had faced them once again, and this time, she had not only survived, she had triumphed. The warrior looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice soft. Sarah nodded, her chest swelling with pride. She had done it. She had stood her ground and faced the fear head-on. And for the first time, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. The days following the battle felt strangely calm, but Sarah knew that calm was only temporary. The warrior had told her many times that survival was not just about fighting. It was about endurance, about knowing when to act and when to wait. The lessons had been intense, each day pushing her limits, but she felt herself growing stronger with every challenge they faced. The outlaws had been defeated, but there was still a long road ahead. The world was changing, and she had to change with it. They had moved deeper into the forest after the fight, leaving behind the remains of their enemies and finding refuge in a small, secluded valley. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, but there was a quiet in the air now, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The warrior had not said much since the battle, but Sarah could see the weight of the decision ahead in his eyes. They were both waiting for the next move, for the next challenge. It was during one of those quiet evenings that the warrior spoke again. They had just finished another day of training, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. The warrior was sharpening his knife by the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah sat a few feet away, her eyes scanning the forest, always alert, always watching. "Tomorrow," the warrior said, breaking the silence. "It's time for you to face the hardest part of this journey." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she was ready. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The warrior's gaze met hers, his eyes piercing in the firelight. "We leave the valley," he said simply. "We will find the outlaws again." Sarah swallowed hard, her stomach tightening at the thought. The outlaws. They were still out there, and now, they would have to face them once again. She had fought them once, but it hadn't felt like the end. It was only the beginning. The warrior stood and stretched, his tall figure silhouetted against the firelight. "You have learned how to survive, but now you must learn how to live without fear. When we find them, you will have a choice. You can fight, or you can run, but you will do so on your terms." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart racing. She had faced so much already, but this would be the ultimate test. She wasn't sure if she could do it, but she knew she had no choice. The warrior was right. She had learned how to fight, how to survive, but now she had to learn how to live in the world she had chosen. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. "I won't run." The warrior's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Now we rest. Tomorrow we move." The night passed quietly, but Sarah did not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the stars above, her mind racing with thoughts of the battle ahead. She had learned so much in the past weeks. She had trained her body, sharpened her senses, and built a strength inside her she never knew she had. But now, she had to face her greatest challenge yet, not the outlaws, but the fear inside herself. The next morning, they packed up quickly, the warrior's movements smooth and efficient. They left no trace, moving like shadows through the trees. Sarah followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she felt ready. They traveled for hours, the forest growing denser around them as they pushed forward. The warrior led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his every movement controlled and precise. Sarah kept close behind, her senses sharp, her mind focused. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she pushed the fear away. She had trained for this. She had learned how to survive, and she would not let the outlaws take that away from her. As the day wore on, they reached the edge of a small clearing. The warrior stopped and signaled for Sarah to halt. "They're close," he said, his voice low. "Get ready." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she looked around the clearing. There was no sign of the outlaws, but she knew they were close. She could feel it in her bones. The warrior knelt down, his hand brushing the dirt beneath him. "They've been here recently," he said. "But they're not alone." Sarah's blood ran cold at his words. Not alone. Who else could be with them? The warrior stood and looked at her, his face grim. "Stay close. Stay silent. We strike when the moment comes." Sarah nodded, her breath shallow as she crouched beside him. They waited in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Her thoughts raced, but she kept her focus on the task ahead. The moment would come soon. She had learned to trust her instincts, to listen to the land, to read the signs. Now, it was time to put everything into practice. The warrior's hand went up, signaling for Sarah to prepare. "Now," he whispered. They moved as one, silent and swift, like shadows in the night. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the warrior into the clearing. The battle was about to begin. The outlaws were closer than Sarah had anticipated. The warrior's signal was sharp and clear, and without a second thought, they moved swiftly into action. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as the shadows deepened and the tension in the air thickened. This was it, the final test. The warrior led the charge, his movements fluid and practiced. Sarah followed, her steps quiet but determined. She had fought before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, and now, she had to rely on everything she had learned from him, everything she had learned about herself. As they closed the distance between themselves and the outlaws, Sarah's heart raced, but there was no room for fear. She had pushed that aside long ago. The warrior's calm presence beside her was the anchor she needed. They stopped just outside the clearing where the outlaws had camped, the crackle of their fire faintly reaching their ears. Sarah could see the movement of shadows ahead. There were 5, just as before, huddled around the fire, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their sight. The warrior crouched low, his eyes scanning the group. Sarah mirrored him, her breath steady. The moment felt suspended in time, everything leading up to this single breath, this single heartbeat. Now, the warrior's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of everything that had come before. Without hesitation, they struck. The warrior moved first, a blur of motion, and in the span of seconds, one of the outlaws fell. Sarah followed, her knife flashing in the low light, as she swiftly disarmed and took down another attacker. The battle was quick, but brutal. The outlaws didn't stand a chance. The warrior was. A force of nature, silent, swift, and efficient. Sarah fought with everything she had, the training, the skills, the strength of mind she had built over the past weeks. All of it poured into this moment. When the last of the outlaws hit the ground, Sarah stood, panting, her chest heaving with exertion. The adrenaline from the fight still surged through her, but there was no fear. She had faced them, and she had won. The warrior stood beside her, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the fallen outlaws. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands trembling with the rush of the fight. "It's over," she said quietly. The warrior nodded, but his gaze was still scanning the surroundings, alert. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's never over." Sarah looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had thought it was done, but she knew now that survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about staying alert, always being prepared, and knowing when to strike and when to retreat. They stood together in the clearing, the bodies of the outlaws around them, and for the first time, Sarah truly understood what the warrior meant. "You've learned what you needed to," he said, turning to her. "But now, you must continue. The world will always challenge you. You will face threats, you will face hardship. But you are no longer the woman who ran from Red Oak. You are stronger than that now." Sarah nodded, the weight of his words settling into her. She was stronger. She had proven that, not just to him, but to herself. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady. The warrior didn't answer immediately. He stood in silence, his eyes on the distant horizon. "Now, we move forward," he said. "There is more to see, more to learn. But you will never fear anyone again. Not because you are invincible, but because you have the strength to stand tall, no matter what comes." Sarah looked around at the quiet clearing, the remnants of the battle fading into the shadows of the forest. For the first time, she felt truly free. She was no longer bound by fear. She had faced the outlaws, she had fought, and she had won. The past would always be there, but it no longer had the power to control her. She was ready for whatever came. Next, Let's go, she said, her voice firm. The road ahead is ours to take. Together, they turned and walked away from the clearing, leaving behind the remnants of the battle, but carrying forward the lessons learned. The warrior's presence beside her, steady and unyielding, reminded her that she was never truly alone. She had faced the fear, conquered it, and in doing so, she had found the strength to face the world on her own terms. And with each step forward, Sarah knew that she was ready for whatever the future held.